I'm with Nick Leiserson, the Assistant National Cyber Director in the Office of the National Cyber Director in the White House. Nick, thanks so much for taking the time to join us.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jason, for having us.
There's a lot going on in your office around what the commonly known as cyber harmonization. This is about regulations, and we have different regulations for different things. There's some great anecdotes that were talked about. And when I say great, I think maybe sad is the better word about, well, we had the IRS come in, and then we had the CMS folks come in, and then we had this other person come in, and each of them were looking at very similar areas of cybersecurity, and we couldn't share the information easily, and it took time, and something to the effect of 30 to 40%, maybe even as high as 70% of some CISOs' times or CISO staff's times is meeting compliance issues. So let's start with that issue. The cyber harmonization around regulations is a big priority for the White House. What are you hearing? Why is this risen to a new level in many ways?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Jason. And it is a real problem, and I think that was illustrated for us in the responses we got to a request for information we put out last summer and early fall. We heard from 11 different critical infrastructure sectors. We heard from state governments. We heard from academia. And there are a couple of key themes that came out of them. One that I think has been illustrated from what I've heard so far today is we are getting suboptimal cybersecurity outcomes because of disharmonious regulations. So what does that practically mean? It means that when you have duplicative requirements, and more importantly, duplicative compliance regimes associated with them, people spend more time on compliance instead of on actually improving cybersecurity outcomes. So from our perspective, right, this is why the White House cares about this. I am not a regulatory lawyer. I didn't get into this to work on the nitty-gritties of trying to figure out how to do regulation effectively. I got into this business for cybersecurity outcomes. But what we are increasingly finding is, even as we recognize in the face of threats like those from the PRC, that we need to elevate our cyber game, including through imposition of minimum requirements. If we're not doing so in a harmonized manner, we're not going to get the outcomes that we need to see. The other key finding that I think we heard from folks was this affects all sectors and folks of all sizes. It's not just big companies, small businesses have problems as well. It's not just financial services across the board in critical infrastructure. And as you mentioned, it's state governments too. There are challenges with a lack of harmonized requirements.
The RFI was the first step in a long process. You took the feedback, and what is happening now? What are you doing with the feedback? How's this driving new changes, policies, initiatives, and the like?
Yeah, so it is exactly, this is the way that the National Cyber Director, Harry Coker Jr. likes to put it is, we're in the business of working on hard problems. That is what ONCD does, and regulatory harmonization is definitely a hard problem. So we took what we learned from the RFI and we really went in two directions with it. The first, we're working on what's really, I would call a pathfinder or a pilot. It's part of implementing the National Cybersecurity Strategy. We're working with regulators in a particular subsector that doesn't have cybersecurity regulations today to see if in a greenfield situation you can come in and ensure that there's a harmonious approach with hopefully some degree of reciprocity. So we're working on kind of a model framework to do that with regulators. Separately, we've also recognized that this is a problem that is in some ways caused by government when it's regulatory, right? And so government is needed to solve it. But in order to do that, we also need to work with our partners in Congress. So the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee held a hearing on this topic in June. I was lucky to get to testify before Chairman Peters, the rest of the committee members about this. One of the points that we raised to them was in order to effectively bring all of the regulators to the table, including independent regulators, it needs some congressional action. And Senator Peters, Senator Lankford took that on. They introduced a bill in July that would give ONCD the ability to convene, right? It's just a convening authority, get all the relevant parties at the table so we can work on designing a framework that is specific to regulation and designed with reciprocity in mind. And that bill was, reported out of the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee the end of July. And, I think we're looking forward to hopefully seeing continued progress on that front from the committee.
I'll start backwards. There's a lot I want to ask you about the Pathfinder pilot, but with the bill itself, and I know there's some sensitivities built in here, it seems rather straightforward. Give OECD some convening authorities, not to create new regulation, but just to bring people together. Because one of the challenges, my understanding is, sometimes some of these independent regulatory agencies don't have to listen to the White House, or if you ask them to come, they can say no. And that's really what this is trying to solve, is to make it so, come on, guys, we are going to do this together, not please, pretty please, let me give you lots of carrots.
Right. And I think there are like two central points to our thesis, right? One is we need all of the stakeholders at the table if we're going to develop something. There are lots of regulators in this space who have a lot of experience dealing with managing cyber risk. We need their insights if we're going to develop common enterprise controls that are harmonized across all of the different critical infrastructure sectors. And this is not to say that there won't be sector-specific controls you need to put on top, but at least for the enterprise IT that is common across all these sectors, we need to be more harmonized than we are. But that means we need to bring the regulators to the table. And that's really what we want, is we want their voices to be part of the conversation. The second point, though, is this demands a strategic approach, right? We are not going to fix this problem pairwise by going across two regulators and saying, okay, how do we try and harmonize here? And then going against two more. I don't remember my combinatorics from math that well in college, but pairwise across the number of federal regulators we have, the number of different kind of regulatory matches we would have to do is extraordinarily large. That's not what we need. We need a framework that is a target that we can say to regulators, this is what you need to harmonize towards.
Is it very similar to what NIST has done with the cybersecurity framework and what you've seen, maybe even whether it's FedRAMP or other or StateRAMP, where, hey, for this sector, cloud providers, here's some minimum basic standards we're asking for to meet with low, moderate, high. It's that same theory.
Yeah, I think, it's important that it's cross-sector. It's not just within a sector. And I think, when we talk about this, we talk about alignment, harmonization, and reciprocity. The risk management frameworks like the NIST cybersecurity framework is critical for alignment. If we're not speaking the same language, we're never going to get to harmonization. But from a harmonization standpoint, we're now talking about what are the specific requirements. And that's really what we need, is to have that common set of requirements. And I think that's different if you look at, how you might be managing risk yourselves as a company, because there's a compliance element too. And our hope is that if you have a common compliance framework, then you can pick controls that are appropriate for that compliance framework. And from the perspective of a regulated entity, you can prove that you're compliant once. And then if another regulator shows up and says, well, you're important to our sector, you have some equities here, you just show that proof of compliance once instead of having to go through a duplicative process.
The bill is still working its way through. Are you feeling pretty good about it? What can you tell us? I know you can never count your chickens before they're hatched, but is there House support? Where are we at? What we have an election coming up. I don't know if you knew that, but we don't know how much we'll get done. There's a big CR plus budget, so there's a lot on the plates of lawmakers. How are you feeling about the bill?
Yeah, so I worked long enough in Congress to know that making prognostications about the future of bills is very tough, and I'm not going to make one. What I will say is we've seen the House Committee on Oversight and Accountability held a hearing on the topic of regulatory harmonization at the end of July as well. There's interest there. We have briefed staff on that committee about what our findings from our RFI were. And I think we've also seen support from the broader community of people who did respond to our RFI and said, we took suggestions that we then surfaced to the Hill and that I think Chairman Peters looked at as well. When developing the bill, there were folks who said exactly this, that you need to have some convening authority at the White House if you're going to develop this framework. And I think we've seen support in the broader community for it as well. As for what happens in the last, 4 months of a Congress, We'll see.
Your guess is as good as mine. If there's sports books on that, maybe we could see the odds. I want to go back to the other piece, which is you mentioned the Pathfinder, the pilot. This is fascinating as well. I know, again, this is still early stages, so there's not much you can talk to, but what's the initial thinking about what this could look like? You mentioned looking at a subsector that maybe where there's not specific or cyber standards already in place, how to put them in place in a way. Is the idea like, okay, well, most of the people who are in this subsector, and I'll make this up, follow ISO XYZ. Could we pull 80% from that ISO standard to create our harmonization? Is that, I'm being broad.
Yeah, so I think in general, there's a whole host of different areas. So let me just take at the strategic level first, and then we'll get to some examples. Strategic level, the way that I look at it is we're talking about we want to help develop, right? The goal of a lot of these initiatives at the center of our approach is saying we need a strategic framework that we can give to regulators and say, harmonize to this, right? That's what we're trying to develop. We view this Pathfinder as a way to prove out some of the concepts, kind of, see if we can shake out good ideas, things that will work, things that won't work, if we try and then broaden that out to broader enterprise ICTS that's more cross-sector. So that's really why we frame it as a pilot. It's like we hope to take lessons we've learned here and apply them in a more broad scale. In terms of how we're looking at it, right, there are lots of questions. One of the first questions is like scope. Hey, can we agree as to who's going to get covered? Because jurisdictions might be slightly different from regulator to regulator. What are the controls that we would think about bringing on? Are they ones that are based on like ISO, if that's something that's already been done? How does that fit into other regulatory models that are already in use by the regulators? And then again, ideally, can there be some form of reciprocity, whether that looks like mutual recognition, whether that looks like saying, oh, we're going to trust this particular regulator's findings for enterprise ICTS. Yeah, working through all of that, but the hope is we can take lessons that we learn there and then apply them more broadly across sectors.
I really appreciate you delving into the pilot. I know, again, it's still early. Things are still being worked forward. Like Bill's, isn't it hard to say when this will get done, but what is there a timeline you can talk to? Are you saying over the next year or the next 6 months? If next summer, if we're here, do you think you'd have something more to report? Like what's your thinking?
Yeah, so we are hoping to have this wrapped in about the next 6 months from the National Cybersecurity Strategy Implementation Plan, and at least have, the framework for how we're going to move out from there.
Is this something that you eventually would make public? Not necessarily the framework, but we worked with subsector XYZ, and here's the results. Is that part of this thinking right now, or is it maybe?
I think it's hard to say exactly what that will look like. What I will say is, I think the expectation is the regulators are going to act on the work that's happened here as they go and ensure that there are requirements set such that we can deal with the national security threats that we have. And then, our hope is at least you'll see the proof in the pudding of, oh, this is more harmonized than what we're used to seeing. And again, maybe we'll also be able to take some of those learnings and inform the broader work that we're doing.
Plenty more to talk about. I'm going to shift over to one of the last things while we have some time together, is this idea of regulations and budget. And you brought up a great example where, we can't just tell you to improve your cybersecurity and not fund it, because that could actually hurt the folks we're trying to help. So talk a little bit about the budget request for 2025 that I know Congress is still in the middle of, but one of the things you do with maybe CMS and or EPA.
Yeah, so I think it's a critical point, right, which is one of the goals of the regulatory efforts in line with the National Cybersecurity Strategy is to drive investments in cybersecurity. However, in many cases, when you're applying them for the first time, there's kind of a gap from what we believe the minimum should be and where things are at the moment. And addressing that gap may require investments that will eventually get built into folks' budgets, which again is part of the goal, but you need some bridging strategy. And there are a couple of places that are great examples in the FY25 President's budget request. One is on healthcare, where there's $1.3 billion requested to help small, rural, critical access care hospitals up their cybersecurity games so that if minimum requirements come out, when they come out, they are better positioned to be able to meet them. Another, for the first time in the water and wastewater system sector, EPA has requested specific cybersecurity money, $25 million for their state and tribal assistance grants. So that's kind of what we mean when we say, all right, we need to drive investment, but in order to get past the starting block to make sure that everyone at least can hit the minimum requirements out the gate, we may need to make some investments there ourselves as well.
Not only will I not ask you about bills and when they will pass, I will also ask you about the budget and what's going to happen there either. So, but I think that's a signal, and I think it's something that this administration has done, is, hey, we just can't tell you to do something without helping you get there. The unfunded mandates, I know, frustrate a lot of CIOs in the federal sector. Oh, great, another unfunded mandate. So it's great to see that. That's kind of, I think you called it maybe a novel approach, not necessarily new, but hey, we haven't done this in the past. Was there some sort of aha moment or some sort of, did someone come to you and be like, Nick, this is a great idea, but?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of the fact that, one of the biggest shifts I think you've seen in the Biden-Harris administration is an emphasis on using the regulatory tool, right? Is that I think Colonial was a very illustrative example where an agency had been sitting on authority for 20 years that they had never used. And we saw what the outcome was and said, no, actually, we probably should have leaned in a little bit more. And that has driven the Biden-Harris administration's approach. But with that, as we have relied more at a national strategic level on, we need to look at how we're using regulation, came the, how are we going to do so effectively? And that's what's really driving both the investments in the budget and the regulatory harmonization work, is to say, yes, we need to use this tool. We need to do it effectively. Doing it effectively means understanding how are you going to get from the status quo today to where you need to go going forward, where there are minimum requirements, and helping to develop bridging. That often means some investment in resources. And it also means trying to ensure we're harmonized to the greatest extent possible, because when we're not, and we're spending money on compliance instead of on cybersecurity, duplicative compliance instead of on cybersecurity, then we're not going to see the cybersecurity outcomes we need.
In the last minute or so we have together, and I really appreciate your time today, this is a hard problem. I don't need to tell you that. I just told you the obvious. But how do you measure your progress? How are you saying, are we better today than we were 6 months ago, 12 months ago? What's that mean from an ONCD perspective of, okay, we are making a difference?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a hard thing to do because we don't have like a register at the moment of cybersecurity regulations. So at the moment, right, like it's pretty idiosyncratic in terms of, as you look at different regs that are coming out, how are we seeing similarities across them? I think that the thing that will most help in terms of giving us that yardstick so that we can do a better job of measuring progress is developing that target, that strategic framework. And that's part of why we want to do it, because right now, the question I most often get is, harmonize against what? And if we have that framework, that is also the yardstick that we can use to say, okay, this is what you need. This is the delta between where you should be and where you are today, and how are we going to get from here to there.
All right. Nick, I really appreciate it. We could talk longer, but I'll let you go back to your day. Nick Leiserson is the Assistant National Cyber Director in the Office of the National Cyber Director in the White House. Nick, thanks so much for taking the time.
Absolutely. Great to see you, Jason.